The gallery was a world of quiet elegance, where the finest pieces of art sat in curated isolation, admired by those with the means to appreciate their value. It was the kind of place where only the rich and influential could afford to play, where names mattered more than talent, and where the mystique of a piece's provenance often overshadowed its true worth. In this realm, one man reigned supreme, Richard Farrow, the owner of the illustrious Farrow Gallery. Richard Farrow had a reputation that preceded him. His gallery was the pinnacle of high society, a place where only the rarest and most expensive pieces graced the walls. He was a man who measured everything, from art to people, in terms of their monetary value. His taste was impeccable, his judgment unchallenged. Or at least, that's what he believed. Farrow was in his mid-50s, with slicked-back gray hair and sharp, calculating eyes that had seen the rise and fall of many artists. His suits were custom-tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his demeanor was one of effortless superiority. He had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young artists walk through his door, each one with their own dream of being discovered. And each one, in Farrow's eyes, was a mere speck in the vast landscape of the art world. Few had ever impressed him. On this particular day, Farrow was leaning against a sleek white table in the center of the gallery, his eyes scanning through the latest batch of portfolios brought to him by a young assistant. The light of the gallery's grand chandelier reflected off the polished marble floors, adding an extra air of importance to the space. He was preparing for an upcoming event, a high-profile exhibition that promised to attract wealthy buyers from all over the world. Farrow wanted only the best for such an occasion, the kind of pieces that would secure his status as the ultimate tastemaker in the art world. At noon, a soft knock echoed through the gallery's doors. Farrow barely looked up, too absorbed in his thoughts. The assistant opened the door, and in walked a young man who looked out of place in the polished surroundings. He was tall and slender, his hands clasped tightly around a worn leather portfolio. His clothes were modest, loose jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. He looked nervous, his eyes flicking from the floor to Farrow, as though unsure if he even belonged in the gallery. "Mr. Farrow?" the young man asked hesitantly. His voice was soft, with an undercurrent of tension, as though he were about to face a great test. Farrow glanced up from the portfolio in his hands and offered a thin smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. He took in the young man's appearance in one sweeping glance, a typical, unpolished artist, most likely from a lower-income background. Farrow had seen his type before. The aspiring dreamers who thought they could make it in a world of refined taste and exclusivity. "Yes, what is it?" Farrow's voice was sharp, as if he had been momentarily irritated by the interruption. The young man swallowed, clearly nervous, but he stepped forward and opened the portfolio to reveal a set of paintings. The colors were striking, vivid reds, oranges, and blues that seemed to pulse with energy. The paintings were abstract in nature, full of wild strokes and bold lines. Each piece seemed to convey emotion, as though the artist had poured something deeply personal into them. Yet, to Farrow, the work seemed chaotic and unrefined. "These are my pieces," the young man said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. "I believe they could be a great fit for your gallery." Farrow studied the paintings with a critical eye. They were bold, certainly, but they lacked the subtlety he valued in his collection. The brushstrokes were too wild, the colors too garish. It was clear to him that the artist had little understanding of the nuances of technique, and it was even clearer that the pieces lacked any real sophistication. They were the kind of paintings that might impress at a college art show, but not in the refined world of established galleries. "Interesting," Farrow said with a slight smirk, his eyes narrowing. "But I must admit, I don't see the appeal. The brushwork is crude, and the colors are overwhelming. They lack the balance I prefer in the works I showcase here." The young artist's face faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I understand. But I've had a lot of feedback about the emotional depth of these pieces. They speak to people, in ways that—" "I'm sure they do," Farrow interrupted with a wave of his hand. "But art is more than just emotion, young man. It's about technique, history, and sophistication. he gestured vaguely at the paintings. This looks more like the work of someone who hasn't been trained properly. No formal education, no understanding of the history of art. It's all just a bunch of random brushstrokes and color splashes. The young man's face flushed, but he held his ground. I might not have had formal training, but that doesn't mean my work lacks value. Sometimes, raw emotion and expression are more important than what's been taught in classrooms. Pharaoh chuckled softly, a patronizing smile forming on his lips. You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But in the world of art, spirit doesn't pay the bills. People want something that reflects refinement, something with real technique. What you've got here is, how shall I put it, very unpolished. The artist's hand shook slightly as he clutched the portfolio tighter. He was used to rejection, used to people not understanding his work, but there was something about Pharaoh's dismissive tone that cut deeper. I just thought, maybe you'd see something different in them. But I guess I was wrong. Pharaoh stood up, stepping closer to the young man. I'm not saying your work is worthless, he said, his tone softening just a fraction, though his eyes still held that calculating edge. But I don't think it's right for this gallery. I'm sure you'll find some place for it, but it's not here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important matters to attend to. The artist nodded, though the sting of rejection was clear in his eyes. He gathered his paintings and quickly stepped back, eager to leave the gallery. As he turned to leave, Pharaoh called out after him, "Good luck with your emotional art. I'm sure someone will appreciate it." The artist didn't respond. He simply walked out the door, the weight of rejection settling on his shoulders. Pharaoh watched him leave with a bemused expression. In his mind, the artist was just another casualty of the art world, a dreamer who couldn't see the bigger picture. Pharaoh was confident that he had made the right choice, as he always did. After all, he knew what real art looked like. And this, he thought, was just another fleeting moment in the never-ending parade of failed artists. The young artist, whose name was Elijah Turner, walked out of Pharaoh Gallery with a sense of defeat weighing heavily on his chest. The rejection wasn't new, he had faced it countless times before, from galleries, critics, and even fellow artists. It seemed like the world refused to understand the kind of art he created, the kind that came from deep within, raw and unrefined, but powerful in its own way. Elijah had never been formally trained, and that fact had always been his greatest hurdle. He had tried to explain to galleries, curators, and critics that his art wasn't about technique or rules, it was about emotion, about capturing something real, something primal. But no one seemed to care. They only cared about what they could measure, what they could categorize, and what fit neatly into established norms. As he walked down the street, Elijah's mind wandered back to his humble beginnings. He grew up in a small apartment in a poor neighborhood, the son of a single mother who worked long hours just to make ends meet. She had always encouraged him to pursue his passion for drawing and painting, even though she couldn't afford to buy him the art supplies he needed. Elijah had learned to create art with whatever he could get his hands on, old cardboard, scraps of fabric, discarded paintbrushes. His art was born out of necessity, born from the desire to create something beautiful in a world that often seemed devoid of beauty. He had never been part of the art elite, nor had he ever cared to be. He wasn't interested in expensive art schools or prestigious galleries. His drive came from a need to express something larger than himself, something that transcended conventional art forms. He painted not for approval, but to give voice to the struggles he had witnessed in his own life, his neighborhood, his community, and his people. His work was an outpouring of the trials and triumphs of being black in a world that often looked the other way. Yet, despite pouring his heart and soul into his paintings, he had been met with indifference and ridicule at every turn. He'd been told time and time again that his art lacked polish, lacked the finesse that was required for it to be considered valuable. And, even worse, he had been told that his work lacked taste, as if art could be measured in terms of elitist standards rather than the raw emotions they were meant to evoke. That afternoon, after leaving the gallery, Elijah made his way back to his small studio apartment, located in the heart of the city's art district. It wasn't much, just a small room with cracked walls, faded paint, and a thin, dusty rug on the floor. But to Elijah, it was home. It was here, surrounded by the smell of oil paints and the hum of a broken heater, that he felt truly alive. His art was stored here, carefully protected from the outside world. Unlike the pieces he had shown Pharaoh, these paintings were different. These were his true masterpieces, works that he had been hiding for years, convinced that they were too bold, too radical, and too raw to be understood. They were pieces he had painted in the quiet of the night, when the world was asleep, and he could finally unleash the chaos and beauty that had been brewing inside him for years. One of the paintings, in particular, stood out. It was a large canvas, nearly 6 feet tall, painted in deep shades of red, black, and gold. At first glance, it seemed like an explosion of color, with thick, swirling brushstrokes and sharp, jagged lines that conveyed an almost violent energy. But upon closer inspection, the viewer could see that there was a delicate balance to the chaos, an intricate pattern that spoke of struggle and resilience, of anger and hope intertwined. It was a painting that demanded attention, a painting that told a story without words. Elijah had poured everything into this piece. It was a reflection of his own journey, his struggles with identity, with being an artist in a world that didn't seem to care, with finding his place in a society that often rejected him. It was an abstract self-portrait of sorts, a representation of all the pain, the confusion, and the pride that came with being black in a world that constantly tried to define him on its own terms. But despite the raw power of the painting, Elijah knew that it wouldn't be accepted by the art establishment. He had shown it to a few friends, other struggling artists, gallery owners who prided themselves on being avant-garde but only showcased work that fit into neat categories of what was considered acceptable or fashionable. They had all dismissed it, saying it was too aggressive, too political, or too loud. Elijah stared at the painting now, standing before it in the dim light of his apartment. He wondered if he would ever find a place for it, a space where it would be seen and understood, not just for its technical merit, but for the emotions it captured, for the story it told. In his heart, Elijah knew that he was capable of something bigger than the art world had allowed him to show. He was more than just a young man with big dreams. He was an artist with a voice, a vision that transcended the narrow definitions of what art should be. But the world had never given him the opportunity to prove it. As the night wore on, Elijah made a decision. He would no longer wait for the art world to come to him. If they didn't understand his work, he would make them understand. He would take his masterpieces, his boldest creations, and show them to the world. He didn't need a gallery's approval. He didn't need the validation of wealthy collectors or famous critics. He needed the courage to take the next step, no matter what. The next morning, Elijah packed up his most important paintings, the ones that had been hidden away for so long, and set off toward Pharaoh Gallery. His mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above all others: what if this time was different? What if Pharaoh, the man who had mocked him, could see beyond his own prejudices? What if his paintings could finally find a place in a world that had been unwilling to embrace them? Elijah didn't know the answer. But what he did know was this: he was done hiding. His work was worth seeing. It was worth something more than what the art world had deemed it. And no matter what it took, he was going to make sure it was seen, heard, and valued. He left his apartment that morning, with the belief that his true masterpieces were about to change everything. Elijah arrived at Pharaoh Gallery on a crisp Tuesday morning, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edges of the portfolio. He had spent the previous night preparing his paintings, making sure each piece was perfectly packaged, carefully wrapped in protective cloths. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the grand doors of the gallery, which loomed before him like an imposing fortress, one that had once rejected him but now stood as the gateway to his future. The gallery's sleek exterior gleamed in the morning light, its walls a crisp white, showcasing a minimalist design that spoke volumes about the high society it catered to. Pharaoh Gallery was known for its exclusivity, a space where only the most refined works of art were displayed. The thought of having his pieces displayed there was daunting. He wasn't sure whether he was being brave or foolish. But something deep inside him told him it was time to take this step. Inside, the gallery smelled of fresh paint and polished floors, and the air was thick with the quiet reverence of a space devoted to the appreciation of art, at least, to the kind of art that the elite deemed worthy. It was eerily still, the only sound the soft echo of footsteps and hushed conversations as visitors milled about, admiring the carefully curated displays of contemporary art. As Elijah stepped into the lobby, the receptionist glanced up from her desk with a raised eyebrow. Her eyes lingered for a moment on his worn jeans and simple shirt, but she said nothing. Perhaps she assumed he was another artist or an assistant carrying in new pieces for display. Either way, it wasn't her job to judge, she merely gestured toward the back hallway where Pharaoh's office was located. When Elijah reached Pharaoh's office, he stood in front of the door, collecting his thoughts. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, perhaps a cold dismissal, or maybe a surprise at his persistence. But the feeling in his gut told him that this was different. He wasn't here to beg for approval anymore. He had something to show, something that couldn't be ignored. He knocked twice, and Pharaoh's voice from inside called out, "Come in." Elijah entered, and the sight of the gallery owner startled him for a moment. Pharaoh was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, the kind of desk that spoke of power and authority. His sharp, calculating eyes flicked up briefly, taking in Elijah's presence with an expression that seemed equal parts curious and dismissive. Elijah took a deep breath and walked forward, his portfolio in hand. "I brought some new pieces," Elijah said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I believe they're worth considering for your upcoming exhibition." Pharaoh leaned back in his chair, not bothering to rise. His fingers drummed slowly against the desk, his face unreadable. "I see. I assumed you had given up after our last meeting. I take it these are different from the last batch?" Elijah nodded, carefully setting the portfolio down on the desk between them. His hands trembled slightly as he began to unroll the first painting, a large canvas, nearly 5 feet wide, covered in bold, contrasting colors. The deep reds and golds burst from the canvas like flames, swirling around a central shape that seemed almost human, almost abstract. The jagged brushstrokes gave the piece an energy that was raw, explosive, yet hauntingly beautiful. Elijah watched Pharaoh's reaction closely. The gallery owner's expression remained unreadable as he leaned forward, his fingers tapping on the desk. He didn't say anything at first, simply studied the painting with a measured gaze, his lips tight. Elijah was about to say something when Pharaoh finally spoke. "Well, it certainly isn't boring," Pharaoh remarked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But I'm afraid it's far too chaotic for my taste. Art should have a certain calmness to it, a certain grace. This is disorganized. It looks like a tantrum on canvas." Elijah felt a sting at the comment, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This piece reflects a lot of my personal journey, the anger, the frustration, and the strength that comes from it. The chaos is intentional. It's not just random strokes. It's the story of resilience." Pharaoh didn't respond immediately, instead moving on to the second painting Elijah had brought. This one was different, it was more subdued, the colors softer, the lines flowing in a more deliberate, almost meditative way. The shapes seemed to be interlocking, like puzzle pieces, their interwoven patterns hinting at something larger, something bigger than the sum of its parts. Pharaoh's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, it seemed like he was considering the piece more seriously. His gaze flicked back to Elijah, then to the painting again. This one's better. But it's still not quite there. It's too abstract, too far removed from anything recognizable. If I didn't know better, I'd say you're simply throwing a bunch of colors together and hoping something sticks." Elijah felt his heart sink. He had put so much of himself into these pieces, each brushstroke a reflection of his experiences, his struggles, his soul. How could Pharaoh not see it? How could he not understand? But just as Elijah was about to pack up and leave, something unexpected happened. Pharaoh picked up the third painting from the portfolio, a piece that Elijah had kept hidden for years. It was a large, bold statement piece, full of black, gold, and fiery reds, a visual explosion of emotion and meaning. It was unlike any of his other works, the most personal of them all. For a long moment, Pharaoh said nothing. He simply studied the piece with an intensity that Elijah hadn't seen before. The silence stretched on, as if Pharaoh was trying to understand something deeper, something intangible. His usual smug expression faltered for just a second, replaced with something closer to surprise, maybe even awe. "This," Pharaoh murmured, his voice softer than before. "This is different. This has power." Elijah couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope flicker in his chest. It's a part of me. It's everything I've experienced, everything I've felt. It's more than just paint, it's the story of survival, of pride, of finding meaning in a world that doesn't always value you." Pharaoh's eyes remained locked on the painting, and for a moment, Elijah thought he saw something like respect pass through his gaze. "You've got something here," Pharaoh said quietly, almost to himself. "This piece, it might just have the kind of emotional impact I've been looking for." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. "So, you'll consider it?" Pharaoh leaned back in his chair, studying the painting one last time. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set the painting down, his gaze flicking to Elijah with a mix of caution and curiosity. "I'll admit, this is intriguing. But we'll need to see how the market responds to it. Let's see if the collectors are as moved as I am." Elijah couldn't believe what he was hearing. After everything, after being dismissed and ridiculed, he had finally found something that had made Pharaoh pause. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. "I'll arrange for a private viewing," Pharaoh continued, "but don't get ahead of yourself. The art world isn't as simple as you think. If this piece works, maybe we can talk about a larger exhibition." Elijah nodded, his heart racing. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah allowed himself to believe that he was on the verge of something big. The world might finally be ready to see him, not as a failure, not as an outsider, but as the artist he always knew he could be. In the weeks that followed Elijah's meeting with Pharaoh, things began to move in unexpected directions. The gallery owner's interest in Elijah's third painting, the one that had captured something deeper than anything he had ever made before, wasn't just a fleeting moment of curiosity. Pharaoh had arranged a private viewing for several high-profile collectors and art critics. Elijah, who had spent years laboring in obscurity, now found himself standing before some of the most powerful people in the art world, waiting for their reaction. It was a surreal experience. Elijah had never imagined he would be in the same room as people who could make or break an artist's career. As he stood there, watching the guests file in, each one more impeccably dressed than the last, Elijah tried to calm the nerves that were racking his body. His palms were sweating, his heart racing in his chest, and his mind was racing with 100 different thoughts, each one more anxious than the last. The painting was the centerpiece of the room, displayed under a soft spotlight that made the golds and reds seem to shimmer, giving the piece a dynamic life of its own. It felt like the painting was breathing, almost alive with the emotion Elijah had poured into it. The critics and collectors moved about the room, admiring the other works, but every so often, Elijah caught someone's gaze lingering on his piece. It was a reaction he hadn't expected. There was something in their eyes that spoke of more than just professional interest. It was as though they saw the soul of the work, something they hadn't seen in the other, more traditional pieces that surrounded it. But despite the growing sense of validation, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something much bigger. The question of whether or not the piece would be bought, whether it would be hailed as a masterpiece, still hung over him. And just as he was about to retreat into his thoughts, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find a tall, elegant woman standing behind him. She had an air of quiet confidence, her eyes sharp and observant, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made Elijah pause. She wasn't dressed in the typical gallery owner style, no tailored suit or expensive jewelry. Instead, she wore simple yet refined attire that spoke of someone who wasn't interested in impressing others with her wealth. The woman's gaze moved from Elijah to the painting, and then back to him. "That's quite a piece you have there," she said, her voice calm and measured, yet filled with an undeniable curiosity. It speaks volumes. Elijah blinked in surprise. This wasn't someone he had expected to notice him or his work. Most of the collectors were dismissing the piece or merely nodding politely, but this woman was different. She wasn't just looking at the painting, she was studying it. Like Pharaoh, she seemed to be trying to understand its essence, its meaning. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice unsure. It's been a long time coming." The woman nodded. "I can tell. The anger, the frustration, but also the resilience. It's all there, raw and unfiltered." She paused, looking at him with something that bordered on sympathy. "It's very personal. It's brave, really." Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. He had always struggled to express the depth of what he was trying to say with his art, and yet here was this woman, not only seeing it but understanding it. He hadn't expected anyone to truly get it, not in this world that seemed so focused on the superficial. "I'm Eleanor," the woman continued, offering her hand. "I'm an independent curator. I don't usually work with galleries like Pharaoh's, but I've been following your work for some time now. I'm impressed." Elijah took her hand, still reeling from the shock of hearing that someone had been paying attention to him, even before this private viewing. "I don't know what to say. I never thought anyone would actually see what I was trying to do." Eleanor smiled, a warm, genuine expression that put him at ease. "You've done more than try. You've succeeded. Your work has an energy that I haven't seen in years, and that's what the art world needs. Something fresh. Something that challenges the norms." She leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping lower as if sharing a secret. "I want to help you get your work out there. I think it could be more than just an exhibition. I think it could change things." The words hit Elijah like a wave. Change things? He had always dreamed of that kind of recognition, of having his work seen not just as another painting but as something that could spark conversation, change perceptions, and challenge the status quo. But to hear someone with real influence in the art world, say that his work could do that was beyond anything he had hoped for. I don't know what to say," Elijah stammered. "But I've always believed that art should mean something. It's not just about pretty pictures. It's about telling stories, about pushing boundaries." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "Exactly. That's why I think you're going to make it. I can help you with the next steps. We'll find you an audience, real collectors, not just those who follow trends. Your story is what's going to set you apart. It's what will make them buy your work. But more than that, it's what will make them respect you as an artist." Elijah's heart raced. Could this really be happening? Could he, a struggling artist from a small neighborhood, truly be on the verge of something monumental? Eleanor's words were more than just encouragement, they were a lifeline. For the first time in years, Elijah felt like he wasn't just an outsider, looking in at a world that didn't care. He was finally part of something. The doors that had once been closed to him were now opening, and he had Eleanor to thank for that. As the evening went on, more people gathered around the painting, discussing it with a reverence Elijah hadn't thought possible. Pharaoh, who had initially dismissed his work, had changed his attitude entirely. He now hovered near the painting, watching as the collectors, some of the most influential figures in the art world, began to take a genuine interest in it. By the end of the night, Pharaoh had approached Elijah with a new proposition. "Your painting," he began, "it's created quite a stir. I didn't expect this kind of reaction, but I think we might be able to do something larger. There's talk of a private auction. I'm willing to help you with it, but I want exclusivity." Elijah could hardly believe what he was hearing. What had started as an awkward meeting with a skeptical gallery owner had now transformed into a real opportunity, a chance to not only showcase his work to the right people, but to have it valued for its true worth. With Eleanor's support and Pharaoh's new enthusiasm, Elijah was on the precipice of a new chapter in his life. The art world might not have been ready for him before, but it certainly was now. And he was ready to make his mark. The day of the private auction arrived, and Elijah could hardly believe how quickly everything had unfolded. Just a few weeks ago, he had been struggling to make ends meet, wondering if his art would ever be more than just an escape from the harsh realities of life. Now, he was standing at the heart of one of the most exclusive art events in the city, surrounded by some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the world. It felt surreal, like he had been transported into another world entirely. The auction was being held in a grand ballroom, the kind of place where chandeliers hung from the ceiling like diamonds, and the floor gleamed with polished marble. Every inch of the space exuded wealth and exclusivity. The walls were adorned with some of the finest works of art, but Elijah knew that tonight, it was his work that would steal the spotlight. His painting, the one that had captured the attention of critics and collectors alike, was the centerpiece of the auction, a bold statement piece that had everyone talking. As the guests filed into the room, Elijah couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. This wasn't just about selling a painting anymore. This was about proving to himself and to the world that he had the talent, the vision, and the drive to succeed in a world that had once ignored him. It was about showing that the chaos, the raw emotion, and the resilience that had fueled his work were worth something, that they mattered. Eleanor, who had been by his side throughout the entire process, leaned over and whispered in his ear as the event began. "This is it, Elijah. Tonight's your night. Just remember, don't let the pressure get to you. You've already won by getting here." Her words were calming, but Elijah's heart was still racing. He looked around the room and saw faces he recognized from the art world, critics, curators, collectors, all of them dressed in expensive suits and gowns, their eyes scanning the works of art with a practiced eye. But despite the lavish surroundings and the air of refinement, there was an energy in the room that Elijah couldn't ignore. It was a buzz, a sense of anticipation that built with each passing moment. Then, it was time. The auctioneer, a well-dressed man with a smooth, practiced voice, stepped to the front of the room, signaling that the auction was about to begin. He introduced the first lot, a well-known artist whose work was consistently in high demand. As the bidding began, Elijah tried to remain calm, but his thoughts kept drifting back to his own painting. His heart pounded as he waited for the auctioneer to reach his piece. Finally, the moment arrived. The auctioneer cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone. "And now, we come to a very special lot. Lot number 12. A striking, bold, and emotionally powerful work by an emerging artist. Elijah Kingston's Resilience. A true masterpiece that captures the raw power of the human spirit. Let the bidding begin." The spotlight shifted to Elijah's painting, and a hush fell over the crowd. The light caught the gold and red swirls, making the piece shimmer in a way that only amplified its intensity. Elijah's stomach twisted as the auctioneer took a step back, allowing the room to take in the artwork. It didn't take long for the bidding to start. A voice from the back of the room called out, 500,000. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. 500,000? Was this real? The auctioneer nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. 500,000. Do I hear 600,000? The bidding continued, rising in increments that felt dizzying to Elijah. Each new bid was a validation, a confirmation that his work was worth something, that it had the power to captivate those who could afford to pay for it. The room was alive with energy as voices called out, competing for the painting. Elijah couldn't tear his eyes away, watching in awe as the price climbed higher and higher. 700,000, a voice called out. The room seemed to shift again, and Elijah saw Pharaoh standing near the back, his arms crossed, a small but satisfied smile on his face. Pharaoh had been instrumental in arranging the auction, but it was clear that he was also watching with interest, his eyes glinting with anticipation. Elijah couldn't tell if it was the thrill of the auction or genuine admiration for the work, but either way, he could feel Pharaoh's approval. 800,000, came another voice, and Elijah's heart nearly stopped. This was happening. This was real. The auctioneer raised his gavel, and the bidding slowed. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone waited to see who would make the final bid. The tension in the air was palpable. Elijah could hardly breathe. Finally, a voice called out, 1 million. Elijah's head spun. 1 million? He had never imagined his work would command such a price. The room held its breath as the auctioneer scanned the room one last time. It felt like time had stopped. Going once, the auctioneer said. Going twice. Elijah's pulse raced. Was this really happening? Sold. The gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed in Elijah's chest. The room erupted in applause, and Elijah felt his legs go weak beneath him. He had done it. He had sold his painting for $1 million. It was more than just the money, it was validation. It was the recognition that he had always craved, the acknowledgement that his work had meaning, that it could stand up to the best of what the art world had to offer. As the applause continued, Elijah stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had never imagined his art would reach this point. He had never imagined that one of his paintings, his expression, his soul, would be worth so much to someone else. Eleanor was at his side in an instant, her smile radiant. Congratulations, Elijah. I told you, you had something special. Elijah could only nod, overwhelmed with emotion. I don't know what to say. I've been dreaming of this for so long. But I never thought it would actually happen. You earned it, she said, her voice full of pride. This is just the beginning. You've shown them what you're capable of. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah believed her. He had made it. The art world might not have seen him at first, but now, they couldn't ignore him. His work had a place among the best, and the journey he had started so many years ago was only just beginning. The night continued, but Elijah barely noticed. His mind was still reeling from the success. As the final gavel struck and the room began to empty, Elijah found himself standing in front of his painting once more. It had been sold, but in that moment, it felt like it was still a part of him, a part of his journey. And he knew, deep down, that he would never be the same again. Elijah spent the following days in a haze of disbelief. It wasn't just the $1 million price tag attached to his painting that stunned him, it was the sheer scale of what had just happened. He had stepped into a world that, until now, had only been a dream to him. Invitations began pouring in from collectors, galleries, and curators who had once ignored him, but now, they were eager to engage with the artist behind the painting that had captured their attention. But amid the newfound attention, there was one invitation that stood out above the rest. It came in the form of a hand-delivered envelope, sealed with gold wax. The elegant script on the front was unmistakable, it was from Eleanor. Elijah had come to see Eleanor not only as a mentor but as a guiding force in this whirlwind of success. Her quiet confidence had been instrumental in pushing him to believe in himself, even when he doubted his own worth. When he opened the envelope and saw the invitation inside, his heart skipped a beat. It was an invitation to a private gathering at one of the most exclusive art estates in the world, a secluded mansion tucked away in the French countryside, where the wealthy elite gathered to discuss art, culture, and investments. The event was being hosted by one of the most influential collectors in Europe, a mysterious figure known only as the art connoisseur. The name was whispered in the circles of the ultra-wealthy, but little was known about the individual behind the name. Some said they were a billionaire with an insatiable appetite for rare and valuable art. Others claimed they were a philanthropist with a passion for supporting up-and-coming artists. Either way, an invitation to the gathering was considered a golden ticket to the pinnacle of the art world. The invitation was clear: Elijah Kingston, your work has made a lasting impression. I would be honored if you would join us for a private exhibition at my estate. Your presence will elevate the event. Elijah read the words over and over again. He had heard rumors about this event, but to be invited, to be recognized by such a powerful figure, felt like a dream. He had barely gotten used to the idea of being a successful artist in the public eye, and now, he was being invited to mingle with the very people he had once thought were untouchable. He couldn't help but wonder, why him? Why now? But then he thought of the painting. The one that had started it all. The one that had connected him to Eleanor and to Pharaoh, the one that had set this entire chain of events into motion. Maybe it wasn't just about the art world accepting him anymore. Maybe he was meant for something more, something greater. With a steadying breath, Elijah wrote a reply to Eleanor, confirming his attendance. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be another chapter in his journey. The day of the event arrived, and Elijah found himself aboard a private jet, heading to the French countryside. The jet, sleek and modern, felt like it belonged to a world that was still foreign to him. He had barely adjusted to the idea of being a successful artist, and now, he was flying to an exclusive estate where he would be surrounded by some of the most influential figures in art and culture. As the plane descended toward its destination, Elijah couldn't help but marvel at the view below. The sprawling estate, surrounded by lush gardens and dense forests, looked like something out of a fairy tale. The mansion itself was a grand, imposing structure with classic European architecture, tall columns, wide balconies, and ornate windows that seemed to tell stories of generations past. It was the kind of place that only the truly powerful could afford to inhabit. When the jet landed, a sleek black car was waiting to take Elijah to the estate. As he drove through the gates and down the long, winding path, his nerves began to set in. What was he doing here? How was he supposed to act in this world, among these people who had lived their entire lives in luxury? The car finally came to a stop in front of the mansion, and Elijah stepped out, taking in the grandeur of the surroundings. A staff member greeted him, guiding him through the grand entrance into a vast hall, the walls adorned with masterpieces from artists whose names Elijah recognized, but whose work seemed almost too far removed from his own humble beginnings to comprehend. As he entered the main room, the first thing he noticed was the sea of well-dressed individuals, each one more polished and refined than the last. The air was filled with a sense of quiet sophistication, with murmurs of conversation floating through the room like the soft hum of an orchestra. Yet despite the elegance, Elijah couldn't help but feel a little out of place. He was used to the gritty, raw world of the streets, the hustle, the struggle. This world, where people discussed art like an investment portfolio, felt completely foreign. But then, just as he was about to retreat into the shadows, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Eleanor standing behind him, her warm smile instantly putting him at ease. "You made it," she said, her voice full of pride. "I knew you would." "I wasn't sure I belonged here," Elijah admitted, his voice low. "Everyone here seems so different. I'm not sure I fit in with them." Eleanor laughed softly. "You belong here more than you think. Your art speaks for itself. That's what they care about." Before Elijah could respond, a voice interrupted them. It was a deep, rich voice, smooth like velvet. "Elijah Kingston, I presume?" Elijah turned to find a tall, elegant man standing before him. He was dressed in a black suit, his dark hair slicked back in a perfect style that spoke of wealth and refinement. His eyes were intense, yet there was a spark of curiosity in them, curiosity that seemed to hold a deeper, more personal interest. "I am the art connoisseur," the man continued, his gaze never leaving Elijah's. "I've heard much about your work, Mr. Kingston. And I must say, I am impressed." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The man whose name was whispered in reverence in the art world had just acknowledged him. Elijah had no idea what this meant or where it would lead, but he knew that this encounter would shape the rest of his career. "I'm honored," Elijah said, finding his voice. "Thank you for the invitation." The art connoisseur smiled. "The honor is mine, Mr. Kingston. I have an eye for art, but I must confess, I don't always trust my instincts. With you, however, I believe I've found something truly exceptional. Shall we discuss your future, your vision?" With those words, Elijah felt a shift in the air, an undeniable sense that this was more than just a meeting. It was the beginning of something that would change the course of his life forever. Eleanor stepped back, giving them space, as the art connoisseur guided Elijah deeper into the mansion. The conversation was just beginning, and Elijah knew that the path he was about to take would lead him to places he had never even imagined. But as they walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just about art. This was about finding his place in the world, a world that had once turned its back on him, but was now opening its doors. He had made it, not just as an artist, but as a person who had something to say. And now, he was ready to say it. The night at the art connoisseur's estate unfolded like a dream, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. The grand halls, the elegantly dressed guests, the whispered discussions about art, it all felt like a world he had been part of for much longer than a few days. But deep down, he knew that what had begun with a single painting had now evolved into something far more complex. A realization was dawning on him, something that would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. After the formal introductions, the art connoisseur led Elijah through a series of intimate rooms adorned with rare and priceless art. They talked, not just about art, but about philosophy, culture, and the very nature of creation itself. The art connoisseur seemed to be studying Elijah, not just as an artist, but as a person. His questions were sharp, probing, seeking to understand the core of Elijah's vision. "I see," the art connoisseur mused as they stood before a striking piece by a well-known contemporary artist, "that your work is more than just visual. It tells a story, one that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. It's raw, unfiltered." "I like that." Elijah felt a surge of pride. "My work is my life. Every brushstroke is a part of who I am. It's all about showing the world what we endure, what we fight through." The art connoisseur nodded slowly, as though the words carried more weight than Elijah realized. "You see, that's what I value most in art, the truth. But not just any truth. The kind that resonates deeply within people. The kind that challenges them to see the world through a different lens." They moved on to other paintings, discussing styles, techniques, and the evolving role of art in society. But as they spoke, Elijah noticed a shift in the conversation. The art connoisseur seemed increasingly intrigued by the story behind Elijah's work, the journey from obscurity to recognition. It was clear that the collector wasn't just interested in the artwork for its value, he was fascinated by the artist's potential. "You've experienced the world that many here only read about," the art connoisseur said, his voice thoughtful. "You've seen the rawness of life, the struggle, the pain, and the triumph. That's something that no amount of privilege can teach." Elijah paused. There it was again, the stark contrast between the world he came from and the world that surrounded him now. He had fought for every inch of success, faced rejection and doubt, struggled with poverty and uncertainty. And now, he was in the presence of individuals whose lives had been cushioned by wealth and status from the moment they were born. But somehow, it didn't feel like a division. In fact, it felt like an opportunity to connect the two worlds through his art. By the time they reached the final room, Elijah felt a deep sense of anticipation. This room was different. It wasn't filled with high-end art or priceless pieces. Instead, it was more intimate, smaller, quieter, and the paintings on the walls had a rawness to them that echoed Elijah's own style. His heart skipped a beat when he saw his own painting, Resilience, displayed in the center of the room, bathed in soft light. The brushstrokes, the chaotic energy, the gold and red swirls, they were there, as vivid and powerful as ever. The art connoisseur stood silently for a moment, taking in the piece. "This," he said, turning to Elijah, "this is what I've been searching for. Not just art, but meaning. You've created something more than just a painting. You've captured the spirit of struggle, of survival. And that, Mr. Kingston, is worth more than any price." Elijah swallowed hard. The words were more than he had ever hoped to hear. They validated everything he had worked for, everything he had struggled through. The pain, the heartache, the frustration, it was all part of a larger narrative, one that was finally being recognized. But it wasn't just about the accolades or the wealth that followed. It was about finding his place in a world that had seemed so distant and out of reach. The art connoisseur turned to him, eyes piercing. "I want to make a proposition." Elijah's breath caught. "A proposition?" "I want to invest in your future," the art connoisseur said. "Not just in your art, but in you as an artist. I see the potential in you, the depth that others might overlook." You're not just another painter. You are an artist who will change the landscape of art itself. I want to offer you the opportunity to work with me, to showcase your work in a way that no one else has ever done before. The weight of the offer hit Elijah like a tidal wave. His instincts screamed to ask about the terms, about the details, about what this meant for his freedom as an artist. But as he looked at the art connoisseur, he realized something important. This wasn't just about business. It was about mentorship. It was about an artist being recognized by someone who understood the true value of creation. I don't know what to say, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. I've spent my whole life trying to get to this point, but I never thought something like this would happen. I've been fighting my entire life just to be seen. The art connoisseur smiled softly. You've been seen, Elijah. And now, the world will see you in ways that you never imagined. This is just the beginning. The weight of the words sank in, and Elijah felt a sense of clarity wash over him. All the struggles, all the doubts, all the pain, it had led him here. To this moment. To this decision. I'll do it, Elijah said, his voice steady now. I'll work with you. I'll show the world what I've always known I could. The art connoisseur extended his hand. Then welcome to the next chapter of your journey. As Elijah shook his hand, he knew this was no longer about just one painting or one auction. This was the start of something much bigger. It wasn't just about selling art, it was about sharing his truth with the world, about using his art to connect people from all walks of life, to challenge their perceptions, and to make them see the raw, unvarnished reality of the human experience. And in that moment, Elijah Kingston understood something he had always known deep down. He wasn't just an artist. He was a storyteller, a truth teller, and the world was finally ready to listen.